It's been wonderful to hear that story, and thank you, Lindsay, for that very, very inspiring overview. We don't have too much time tonight for the questions, but I do want to just put one or two to you in the next 4 or 5 minutes. And it's interesting because 2 or 3 of them bring together things which very often historically we have kept apart. So there's a question about the truth, the wonder, and the power of the gospel. And the question is, do we need miracles, healings, and signs and wonders in order to do the power and the wonder bit and the preaching for the truth? Is that a separation there? And also, the pandemic type ministry showed an integration between social action and evangelism, which often there's a distinction. And then thirdly, someone says, what would you say to someone who says, our culture is very relational and they don't go in for a lot of proclamation or events? So you've got 3 things there. You've got signs and wonders and evangelism, social action and evangelism, relational ministry and preaching ministry. So we've had questions about all of those. Any comments, just very briefly, on how you can integrate all of those?
Well, 3 big questions. Let me start in reverse order. The question of living relationally. Well, I think human beings have always been relational. And I don't think being involved in public proclamation does away with the importance of personal relationships. There was a strong emphasis on the relational in the early church too. You'll notice in Acts 2 that the people met together and shared their possessions and took great joy in it. I'm not suggesting a separation. I'm suggesting that if you look at the approaches, if you like to use the word methods of the early church, they worked on 3 levels: personal friendship, heavily relational. Second, meeting in small groups, or actually in Acts, it was house to house. And in small groups, you can have the opportunity to answer people's questions privately and personally. But there's something punchy and distinctive about having someone who can clearly articulate the core of Christian belief and show how it is both defensible and true objectively and satisfying subjectively. We shouldn't separate the objective and the subjective. What I'm saying is that you need, therefore, to have the 3. The question we need to ask ourselves with proclamation, therefore, is not whether the question, does it work in our culture? That's the wrong question. The question we should be asking is it biblical? And human beings often respond to a clear explanation of a particular worldview, in this case, the Christian gospel. But it's always best, of course, if the invitation can come in the context of an ongoing relationship where people have seen something distinctive about our lives and want to hear exactly what contributes to that distinctiveness. I think the second question was about social action and proclamation. Again, I don't see these necessarily as being separate. Jesus both fed the 5,000 and then he spoke to them. It wasn't either or. Actually, the disciples wanted him only to speak to them. He said, now you've spoken to them. They said, now you've spoken to them, send them away. And Jesus said, no, let's feed them. So he brought the 2 together. John Stott famously said, these things are like the 2 wings of a bird, or they're like the 2 edges of a scissors. It's neither one nor the other. But we must be concerned about people's eternal destiny, as well as their well-being in this life. Jesus did talk about hell or Gehenna. In fact, of the 14 times it's mentioned in the New Testament, Jesus mentions it 11 times. So there is a judgment to come. In all the apostolic sermons, there's reference to that. We therefore do need to be involved in loving people in community and proclaiming the gospel publicly. It's interesting that Harnack, the great German church historian, when he was once asked, why did the early church grow in the first 300 years? And he was an expert on the early church. He said 2 things. They outlived the pagans in caring for them, and they out-argued them. there were lots of apologists like Tertullian or Clement of Alexandria or Augustine or John Chrysostom and others. The early church was full of these wonderful public communicators of the gospel. So clearly in the early stages, there was a concern for the community and public proclamation. It's more difficult for us today in a way because many countries have a health service that's taken over by the government, which also provides education. And Christians in the past made major contributions in these areas. However, we should be looking for ways in which we can help people socially and in community, but not at the exception of the public and clear communication of the gospel. If we love people, we'll want them to feel the love, but we'll want them to understand also why we behave in this way. The third and final question was about proclamation and signs and wonders and the miraculous. I don't have an easy answer to this, except that it is obvious in Acts that often there were signs and wonders and miraculous alongside the public proclamation and in the life of Jesus. Now, some historians try to argue that these signs and wonders, often you get a greater outpouring of them at the time of a new period in the history of God's plan of salvation, like the Exodus, like the coming of the prophets, Elijah and Elisha, like the introduction of the ministry of Jesus, like Acts. And there do seem to have been periods in history, especially in pioneering contexts, where there's more evidence of signs and wonders. That's not to say that they don't occur in all cultures. I believe God is a supernatural God and can perform the miracles. On the other hand, however, as you look at church history again, there are many great evangelists in the history of the church, like I would say Calvin, Luther, Billy Graham, John Stott, Martin Lloyd-Jones, John Wesley, Whitfield, and others, Huss, who proclaim the gospel powerfully and it doesn't seem to have been attended by widespread miracles. Does that mean that they failed or there was less power? Well, these miracles are a gift of God. But in those situations, God was gracious to draw to himself irresistibly people primarily through the lifestyle and the spoken words of believers. So I would say sometimes God brings about these miraculous events, but if we look at church history, there are periods where we don't see as much of them in evidence. But we shouldn't shun away from understanding that the proclamation of the gospel can lead to the transformation of the individuals, which is miraculous. One final illustration in this respect. Many years ago, before I came into student ministry, I was working with Operation Mobilization in South Africa. I went to a community in a village in KwaZulu-Natal, and there I saw some remarkable things happening. I returned to the ship on which I was living, the Logos. I was sharing with an Irish friend who had become a Christian from a drugs background in India. And I said to him, Joe, you'll never guess what I've just seen as I've been up country in KwaZulu. I said, I've just seen remarkable things happening. There's a revival there. And I met one woman who said she'd been raised from the dead. I don't know if it actually happened or not, but I believe her testimony. And then Joe said to me, Lindsay, that's nothing. You've been raised from the dead too. She will die again, but you were dead in your trespasses and sins. And only the grace and the power of God and the gospel could have raised you from the sins that you were mired in. So believe in the power of the gospel. So don't despise it if God, the Holy Spirit, brings about the miraculous, but don't understand also that if he chooses not to, the gospel has lost any of its power. It's still powerful, and we are still called to proclaim it while engaging in society, while caring for people and loving for them at the same time. Please do not say it is either or, it is both and.
Thanks very much, Lindsay.